The ITV studios in London hummed with electric anticipation on this crisp February evening. Banks of cameras gleamed under the blazing studio lights, their lenses trained on two burgundy leather chairs positioned at the center of a carefully orchestrated stage. Behind them, a backdrop of muted blues and golds projected the gravitas befitting what producers had billed as the interview of the decade. In the green room, King Charles III adjusted his navy tie for the third time, his reflection caught in the mirror, revealing the slight tension around his eyes. His private secretary, Margaret Whitmore, hovered nearby with a tablet, scrolling through last-minute briefing notes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Remember, Your Majesty, she whispered. Stick to the approved topics. Climate change, Commonwealth relations, your vision for the monarchy. Mr. Morgan has assured us this will be respectful. Charles nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. At 75, he had endured enough media encounters to know that television personalities like Piers Morgan thrived on unpredictability. Still, this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to speak directly to his subjects without the filter of palace statements and royal correspondence. 3 floors below, in the production gallery, chaos reigned with controlled precision. Monitors displayed multiple camera angles while producers barked instructions into headsets. Sarah Collins, the executive producer, paced behind the director's chair, her anxiety palpable. "This is career-defining television," she muttered to her assistant. "If we nail this, we're golden. If it goes wrong—" She didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew what was at stake. Meanwhile, in another corner of the building, Piers Morgan sat hunched over his notes, a predatory gleam in his eyes. His questions were arranged in careful order, softball openers about the king's charitable work, followed by increasingly pointed inquiries about family divisions, and finally, the topics his producers had specifically warned him to avoid. "Diplomacy is death on television," he murmured to his researcher Emma. "The public wants honesty, not palace pleasantries." Emma shifted uncomfortably. "But sir, the palace was very clear about boundaries." "The palace doesn't pay my salary," Piers interrupted, underlining a particularly provocative question about Prince Harry's memoir. "Besides, if His Majesty can't handle a few direct questions, perhaps he shouldn't be giving interviews." In the studio audience, 200 carefully selected guests settled into their seats. Pensioners who had lived through 5 monarchs sat beside university students who had only known Elizabeth II and now Charles. The air crackled with the weight of history in the making. At 8:55 p.m., King Charles emerged from the green room, flanked by his security detail. The audience rose as one, a wave of respectful applause washing over the studio. He walked with measured steps toward his chair, acknowledging the crowd with a slight nod and the ghost of a smile. Across from him, Piers Morgan straightened his tie and flashed his trademark grin, confident, calculating, ready for battle. 30 seconds to live broadcast, announced the floor manager. The countdown had begun. "Good evening, and welcome to this historic edition of Piers Morgan Uncensored." Morgan began, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm honored to be joined tonight by His Majesty King Charles III in what promises to be his most candid television appearance since ascending the throne." The king settled back in his chair, hands clasped loosely in his lap. "Thank you for having me, Piers. It's a pleasure to be here." For the first 20 minutes, the interview unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Charles spoke passionately about his lifelong environmental crusade, his eyes lighting up as he described the organic gardens at Highgrove and his vision for sustainable agriculture across the Commonwealth. "Climate change isn't a political issue. It's an existential one," the king said, leaning forward with genuine enthusiasm. "We have perhaps 10 years to fundamentally change how we live, how we farm, how we think about our relationship with the natural world." The studio audience hung on his every word, nodding appreciatively. Even the camera operators seemed entranced by the monarch's earnest delivery. In the production gallery, Sarah Collins allowed herself a small smile of relief. Piers nodded along, but seasoned viewers might have noticed the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed impatiently against his notepad. He was a shark circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Your passion is truly admirable, Your Majesty," Morgan said. though his tone carried a subtle edge that made Charles's private secretary shift uneasily in the green room. But speaking of legacies and the future, the king straightened almost imperceptibly, some instinct warning him that the gentle waters were about to turn treacherous. Yes, Charles replied carefully. Morgan's smile sharpened. Let's talk about family. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Charles' relaxed posture stiffened as Morgan consulted his notes with predatory precision. Family is incredibly important to me, Charles replied carefully, which makes it painful when relationships become public. Messy. Morgan leaned forward. When your own son writes a memoir calling you emotionally distant, doesn't that suggest you failed as a father? The question struck like lightning. Audience members gasped audibly. Charles's jaw tightened, but his diplomatic smile held. Family matters should remain private, Piers. But it's not private anymore, is it? Morgan's voice gained momentum. When Prince Harry tells the world you couldn't hug him after his mother's funeral, describes feeling abandoned, that's your legacy. Charles's knuckles whitened against the armrest. Behind cameras, crew members exchanged worried glances. I have always tried to balance the impossible demands. And you've failed. Morgan cut ruthlessly. Failed your sons, just as you failed Diana. The pattern is clear, Your Majesty. For the first time, King Charles looked genuinely shaken. The diplomatic mask was cracking. Charles took a measured breath, his royal training warring with rising emotion. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. I believe, he said slowly, that using personal tragedy for television entertainment crosses a line. Even for you, Piers. Morgan's eyes gleamed. The king was fighting back. Exactly what he'd hoped for. Entertainment? Your Majesty, I'm talking about accountability. The British people deserve to know what kind of man leads them. He shuffled his papers theatrically. You hide behind royal protocol when convenient, but when your own son accuses you of emotional neglect, that's enough. Charles's voice cracked like a whip, startling the front row of the audience. Color flooded his cheeks, and for a moment the 75-year-old king looked remarkably like his younger self. Passionate, wounded, human. In the production gallery, Sarah Collins frantically signaled to cut to commercial, but the director shook his head. This was television gold, even if it was career suicide. Is it enough, though? Morgan pressed relentlessly. Because from where I sit, it looks like a pattern. Diana felt abandoned by you. William keeps his distance. Harry fled the country rather than live under your shadow. At what point do you stop blaming everyone else and look in the mirror? The camera caught a bead of perspiration on Charles's temple. His hands, still gripping the armrests, betrayed a slight tremor. The audience was split, half leaning forward in fascination, half shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed their monarch being systematically dismantled. You don't know what you're talking about, Charles whispered, but his words lacked conviction. Morgan smiled coldly. Don't I? Let's talk about Diana, shall we? The studio held its collective breath. Let's talk about Diana, Morgan whispered, the words devastating in their quiet delivery. The audience gasped. Charles went ashen, his breathing shallow. She was bulimic, suicidal because of your coldness, Morgan continued mercilessly. She threw herself down the stairs while pregnant because she felt so alone. Did you ever apologize for that pain? Stop, Charles whispered. The boys were 12 and 15 when she died, and you couldn't even comfort them properly. Morgan leaned back. Have you ever taken responsibility for destroying the most beloved woman in Britain? Charles's voice cracked. You have no right. She was their princess, and you broke her. Tears glittered in the king's eyes as 27 years of guilt crashed over him live on television. Something snapped inside Charles. The tears vanished, replaced by a fury that seemed to radiate from his entire being. His 75-year-old frame straightened with surprising strength as decades of suppressed anger finally found its voice. How dare you, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The transformation was startling. Gone was the diplomatic monarch, replaced by a man pushed beyond all limits. How dare you exploit a dead woman's pain for your ratings? Morgan's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't the broken man he'd expected. I'm simply asking questions the public. The public? Charles's voice cracked like thunder, silencing the host mid-sentence. You mean your viewers, hungry for blood sport. You're not a journalist, Piers. You're a vulture feeding on tragedy. The audience sat transfixed. Many had never seen their king display such raw emotion. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, riveted by this unprecedented display of royal fury. "I've spent my entire life in service to this country," Charles continued, his voice gaining power with each word. 50 years as heir, working tirelessly for causes you mock: environmental protection, urban renewal, youth opportunity. None of which excuses. I wasn't finished. The king's shout echoed through the studio, stunning everyone into silence. For a moment, he looked every inch the monarch his mother had been: commanding, imperious, unbreakable. You sit there with your smug smile, dissecting my failures as if you're somehow superior. But what have you built, Piers? What legacy will you leave besides cruelty masquerading as journalism? Morgan's composure finally showed cracks. Your Majesty, I think we should... No, we shouldn't do anything you suggest. Charles's eyes blazed. You want honesty? Here's honesty. Yes, I failed Diana in many ways. Yes, I've made mistakes as a father, but at least I've tried to serve something greater than myself, which is more than can be said for a man who profits from other people's misery. The studio fell into absolute silence. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a complete catastrophe. Morgan, for the first time all evening, looked genuinely rattled. Your Majesty, don't. Charles held up a trembling hand. Just don't. But Morgan, sensing his interview slipping away, prepared to deliver his most devastating blow yet. Morgan's face hardened. He had been rattled, humiliated even. But he wasn't finished. With the calculated cruelty that had made his career, he leaned forward and smiled. You know what, Your Majesty? You're absolutely right. I am just a television host. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio. But at least I'm not a weak king leading a dying monarchy into irrelevance. The words hit like a physical blow. Charles recoiled as if slapped. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Morgan continued, his confidence returning with venomous force. Not Diana, not Harry, not your failures as a father. It's about the fact that you're simply unfit for the modern age. A relic. A man so emotionally stunted that he's watching his own institution crumble around him. Charles's face cycled through shock, hurt, and finally, pure rage. His hands gripped the armrests so tightly his knuckles went white. You waited 70 years to be king, Morgan pressed on relentlessly. And what do you have to show for it? Plummeting approval ratings. A son who fled to America. Another who barely speaks to you. A commonwealth that's dissolving. You're not a monarch, Charles. You're a failure wearing a crown. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, deliberately, Charles reached up and pulled off his wireless microphone. The small device clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Your Majesty, someone called from behind the cameras. But Charles was already standing, his face a mask of cold fury and wounded dignity. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that several audience members gasped audibly. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Then the King of England did something unprecedented in the history of British television. He walked away. The scrape of Charles's chair against the studio floor was the only sound in the stunned silence. Every camera followed his movement as he turned his back on Piers Morgan and strode toward the exit with measured, regal steps. His shoulders were rigid, his head held high. Even in his fury, he remained every inch a king. Your Majesty, please. Sarah Collins's voice cracked over the studio intercom, but Charles didn't break stride. The audience erupted. Some gasped in horror. Others began to applaud, while a few actually booed. The sound was cacophonous, unprecedented. No one had ever seen anything like this in the history of British television. Morgan sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had unleashed. We should go to commercial, he stammered, but the damage was already done. Charles reached the studio doors and paused for just a moment, his hand on the handle. The camera zoomed in, catching the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes glistened with unshed tears. For that brief instant, he looked not like a fleeing monarch, but like a wounded father, a grieving widower, a man who had simply endured too much. Then he was gone. The studio doors swung shut behind him with a soft thud that somehow felt like thunder. The red recording light continued to blink, capturing every second of the chaos that followed. In the production gallery, pandemonium reigned. "Cut to black! Cut to black!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The feed was live, streaming to millions of viewers across Britain and beyond. Social media was already exploding, clips of the king's exit spreading like wildfire across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Back in the studio, Morgan finally found his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said shakily, "I think we're going to take a short break." But there would be no break from what had just happened. The image of King Charles III walking off live television was already being shared, dissected, and debated across the globe. In that moment, the monarchy itself seemed to walk out of the room with him. The interview was over. The fallout was just beginning. Within minutes, the world exploded. Hashtagging Charles Walks Off was trending globally before the studio lights had even dimmed. The clip, just 47 seconds of a monarch's dignity cracking under pressure, racked up 3 million views in the first hour. Twitter became a battleground between those defending Charles and those condemning him, while TikTok users set his exit to everything from dramatic opera to comedic sound effects. In Buckingham Palace, the emergency protocols that had been dormant since the Queen's death suddenly roared to life. Private secretaries scrambled to draft statements while press officers fielded hundreds of calls from international media outlets. The King's communications team, caught completely off guard, found themselves managing a crisis unlike any in royal history. "We're in uncharted territory," Margaret Whitmore whispered to her assistant as she stared at her phone, watching the view count climb exponentially. The Queen never walked off anything in 70 years. Never. Meanwhile, Charles himself sat in the back of his Bentley, speeding through London streets toward Windsor Castle. He stared out the window in silence, his reflection ghostly in the glass. His protection officer had tried to engage him in conversation, but the king seemed lost in his own thoughts, replaying the moment when Morgan's words had finally broken through decades of diplomatic armor. Back at ITV, the studio remained in chaos. Piers Morgan, still seated in his chair, scrolled through his phone as his mentions exploded into the millions. Some praised him as a fearless journalist who had finally held the monarchy accountable. Others branded him a bully who had pushed a grieving father too far. "I think I might have gone too far," he admitted quietly to his producer, though his public statements would tell a different story. The audience members filed out slowly, many still in shock, others excitedly calling friends and family to share what they had witnessed. Several had already posted their own videos on social media, grainy phone footage of the moment the king stood up, the scrape of his chair, the stunned silence that followed. Mental health advocates were among the first to weigh in publicly. "What we witnessed tonight was a man in genuine distress being exploited for entertainment. Drive," Sarah Mitchell from Mind tweeted. "This is exactly why we must consider the human cost of our media culture." But the royal commentators were divided. Some called it the most damaging moment for the monarchy since the abdication crisis of 1936. Others argued it was the first time Charles had seemed genuinely human to the public. Vulnerable, real, relatable. By midnight, international news networks were leading with the story. CNN's Chiron read, "British King storms off TV interview." The BBC, more diplomatically, went with, "King ends ITV appearance early." But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just an early exit. It was a watershed moment that would define how history remembered both men. 3 months later, the reverberations were still being felt. The front pages had moved on to other scandals, but the king who walked away had entered the cultural lexicon. Coffee shops across Britain still buzzed with debates about that February night. University students analyzed the clip in media studies classes. Comedy shows built entire sketches around it. At Windsor Castle, Charles had retreated into a more contemplative public role. His first appearance after the incident, a quiet visit to a homeless shelter, drew unprecedented crowds. People called out, "We're with you, Your Majesty," and "You're human like us." The vulnerability that had seemed so damaging in the studio had, unexpectedly, humanized him. "Perhaps," he confided to Margaret Whitmore one afternoon, "walking away was the most honest thing I've ever done on television." Opinion polls told a complex story. Approval ratings for the monarchy had initially plummeted, then slowly recovered, as the public began to sympathize with a man pushed beyond his limits. Mental health charities reported increased donations, with many citing the king's visible breakdown as a reminder that emotional pain affects everyone. Piers Morgan, meanwhile, had parlayed the controversy into a lucrative book deal and international speaking tour. But privately, friends said the interview haunted him. "Did I destroy a man for television?" He was overheard asking at a London restaurant. The clip lived on, archived forever in the digital age. Future historians would mark it as the moment the British monarchy finally shed its last pretense of imperial invincibility. Not through scandal or politics, but through the simple, devastating act of a father and widower saying, "Enough." Charles had lost his composure that night, but perhaps in walking away he had found something more valuable: his humanity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,